You are listening to People, Place, and the Ocean. My name is Jackie, and I will be your host throughout this podcast series that is inspired by the Gros Morne community-led marine atlas. With each episode, we will bring to life the pages of the atlas by learning directly from the people who help tell the story about Gros Morne and its surrounding marine environment. You can download your copy of the Marine Atlas by visiting ecologyaction.ca and visiting the Marine Planning page. Throughout the making of this atlas, we've pulled together research since 1967. For example, the atlas includes research on plankton, corals, and sponges that dates back to 1975, and we have documentation on marine mammals that dates back to 1992. In this episode, we will talk about some of the ongoing scientific research that is helping us to better understand the local marine ecosystems around Gros Morne. In the atlas, this refers to Chapter 7, Understanding the Health of Our Ocean Through Scientific Research. Today, we will be joined by two scientific experts that are calling in. Laura Helanius, an expert on some of the tiniest animals that we can identify. And then we have Ashley Nosworthy, who is an expert on some of the largest animals that we might find in the water. And together, these two can help us to visualize the ecosystem as a whole. Thank you, Ashley and Laura, for joining me today and taking part in this very important project. To start out, I'm going to ask you both to tell me a little bit about yourself, and then I have some questions tailored to each of you because I know you both are involved in some different research, so we'll get into all of that. But first, Ashley, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. My name is Ashley Nosworthy. I'm the CEO and founder of Edgewise Environmental, which is a marine environmental consulting firm. And we focus in marine mammals, seabirds, and underwater noise. My personal background, I don't think to anybody's shock, is marine mammals and underwater sound. And I actually spent over a decade of my life at sea working on various large energy projects and environmental compliance. I have some ties to Bombay, having gone through biology at MUN and going through the research center, which I'm sure we might talk a little bit more about a little bit later. And I am a Newfoundlander, born and bred, and love the West Coast.
Awesome. Yeah, the West Coast is the best coast. That's what they say. How about you, Laura?
So my name is Laura Helanius. I'm a marine ecologist. My background is mainly in marine food webs, particularly in zooplankton, in marine food webs, but also generally in coastal biodiversity and general ecophysiology of zooplankton. So how they feed and their role as prey, their interactions within the plankton, and also the diversity of traits and functions of plankton in general. I'm currently working at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm a research associate in the lab of Dr. Sarah Fortune in her whale ecology and conservation lab. And the lab has interest in zooplankton as prey for large baleen whales, like bowheads and North Atlantic right whales. And they're interested in zooplankton as part of the prey field conditions and how the changes in these like microscopic animals can scale up to baleen whales. So yeah, that's my background.
Wow, very, very interesting, both of you. I'm going to ask you both, but first, Laura, can you tell me why you chose to study in Gros Morne, or what actually brought you to the Gros Morne region with your research?
Okay, so I'm actually very new to Gros Morne. I'm originally from Finland, but I've lived in Halifax for 8 years now. But the first time I visited Gros Morne was last year in the summer of 2024. And I was very impressed, obviously. I'm working in Gros Morne as part of a collaboration. It's a project between our lab at Dalhousie and Atlantic Healthy Oceans Initiative. And it's a large project, and our part of it is to characterize the community composition and the overall abundance of zooplankton in areas that are close to or adjacent to the Gros Morne area and offshore of Gros Morne and inside the bays close to the Gros Morne area. So we're interested in zooplankton in general in the Northeast Gulf of St. Lawrence, but we're particularly interested in the certain copepod, which is a type of crustacean that belongs to zooplankton.
Okay, cool. So you talk about zooplankton, that's your main focus. Can you tell me why should we care so much about zooplankton and what is the significance of it?
I feel like we could write a book about the importance of zooplankton, and actually many people have written books about them. Zooplankton ecologists like to call zooplankton small but mighty. They're microscopic, mainly microscopic, but there are some larger species of zooplankton as well, such as jellyfish. But basically their importance lies in their central role in marine food webs. So they're a very central link between the primary producers, the phytoplankton, and then higher consumers, fish, baleen whales, even certain species of marine birds. And basically they transfer energy and different types of essential nutrients from the plankton that produce them onto the higher trophic levels. And they also graze on phytoplankton. So essentially they have the potential to control primary production in some coastal areas. But as these like central links in food webs, they also have the potential to transfer different types of toxins, such as cyanobacterial toxins from blue-green algae, which then can accumulate up in higher consumers in the food chain.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that too, how zooplankton can be carriers of toxins. I did some work with microplastics before, and so that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Yeah, for sure. So basically their role in the food web is this very essential link.
Can you maybe speak a little bit more about that and how zooplankton can help us better understand the overall function of the marine ecosystem?
So zooplankton, not only are they important in the food webs, but they're also potential indicators of environmental change because a lot of them have very short life cycles, and they're also very sensitive to different kinds of environmental change and to different pollutants. So then these reactions are very obvious in species composition if certain species become extinct because of a change in the environment. And so just monitoring the species composition in an area can give you an indication of changes in, for example, in warming or in salinity or different water bodies coming into the area. So changes in mixing as well.
So now we know what zooplankton or zooplankton does, how it interacts in the food web, why it's so important. But now, Laura, what can you tell us about zooplankton in Gros Morne? Is there anything interesting that you learned about the zooplankton specific to the Gros Morne region? Something that's maybe unique about it, or what else can you tell us there?
Well, in general, I feel like the Gros Morne area and the northeast Gulf of St. Lawrence is kind of an undersampled area for zooplankton, even though there's been a lot of local effort for educational purposes to sample in, for example, in Bombay, particularly. But there was not a whole lot of information on the current species composition and abundance in the area. And I was actually very surprised by the really high diversity of different species, particularly different species of copepods inside the Bombay area. And I think that this kind of high species diversity is always a good sign as a stability of the food web. It adds a kind of resilience to the food web to have many species that are functionally similar or have similar ecological roles, because then in the case of any environmental change, there's a certain redundancy in that food web. So that species diversity was kind of interesting to me. Another interesting aspect in Bombay was a deep site, which was probably over 200 meters deep and harbored a large, very energy-rich species of copepod that is very common in Arctic water. So this is probably an important source of energy for a lot of the fish in Bombay. And we don't know how persistent the species is in the bay, but that's something that I'd really like to find out.
Okay, definitely an area for more research in the future, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. It's also really important to have data from a longer timeline, basically, so that we have something to compare to. So hopefully we'll have a lot more data coming up, especially I spoke about the large Arctic species, Helanius hyperboreus, and that would be a potential indicator of, for example, the source of the water coming into Bombay. So that's something that I'm paying close attention to.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah, that'll be something that, of course, would have to be monitored over multiple years of data. Well, thank you, Laura, for giving us a bit of an overview of zooplankton and the lower levels of the food web, because now we're going to talk with Ashley about some of those higher trophic level species. We know Ashley's more involved with research on some of those larger marine mammals and birds and things like that. So, but before we get into that, Ashley, maybe do you want to give us a quick description of how you came to Gros Morne and what is it that made you want to do research around this area?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first time I ever went to Gros Morne, I was in high school, and it was on a school trip. And we hiked in and around the area. After that, the next time I visited the area was at the Bombay Marine Station, and I did 3 courses as part of my biology degree. So I became really familiar with the area, spending almost an entire summer in and around Bombay and the wider kind of northern peninsula, doing a little bit of travel up and down the west coast. And then once launching Edgewise, it became very clear that there was definite interest, especially in doing some long-term acoustic monitoring on the west coast for marine mammals in particular. And we realized, like Laura, that that area is data deficient when it comes to acoustic monitoring. And so there was an opportunity to work with AHOY, the Atlantic Healthy Oceans Initiative, on a collaborative project. And of course, we jumped at it. And so it's been a really wonderful opportunity that we've been able to be part of.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, there's something very special about Gros Morne. It just draws you in, everyone on this call. So
It does.
totally get that. So since you've started doing some research in the area, what is something unique or interesting that you've learned through your research in the Gros Morne region?
I mean, up to this point, we've learned, and I'll tell the audience, we're still going through the data. So going through acoustic data can be a long process. It can be a lot of data to go through for a period of time. But what we've learned thus far is that there is a diversity of species. And that might not shock listeners, but it's important to always corroborate that. So, what's the data telling us? Are things showing up once in a blue moon? Are they being detected all the time? Are they being detected at particular times or within different spans? So seasonality, or are they showing up more? There can be a 24-hour cycle. And so what we're doing and what we're finding out is that there's a large variation of species, and they're showing up at various times. And so we're kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of some of that data, which is really exciting. And whale sounds are always incredible. And so it's always nice when our bioacoustician sends us along sound clips of some really cool stuff.
Oh my gosh, what a job getting to listen to whale sounds. Honestly, there is something so calming about it. It's remarkable.
There is, and it's really nice. Laura and her research is part of this collaborative project. And I think for the listeners, if I can reiterate anything, it's important to understand all various levels of the food chain, because it's Laura's research that we can then base and say, well, of course, it may show a really rich ecosystem. There's a lot of energy, a lot of food availability. Of course, they would be here. Or if we're not finding certain things and they're showing up, it then poses the question as to why. And so understanding from the little to the big is really important.
Yeah, very well said, Ashley. I'm really glad that you highlighted the diversity aspect in some of the species that you've been looking at. And as we heard from Laura, those little tiny creatures, so really important connection. On that note, how might this diversity of whales or other species that you look at be affected by perhaps changes in the marine ecosystem?
That's a great question. And so acoustics is a great tool to use to monitor things like movement and what we call general occurrence. So unless you're doing a really long-term, in-depth study where you want to learn about things like population size, right now we're just kind of finding out, well, what species are showing up where and when. It's important because if species are showing up in areas where they haven't traditionally been, or if they're showing up in new areas because maybe waters are becoming a little more unproductive, if they're warming, then we're starting to see potentially some of that shift. Now, in the research that we're doing, we haven't done that long enough to make those connections. Those have to be really long-term studies to potentially monitor that. And in our type of field, we call this kind of a baseline. So, what's traditionally showed up where and how can we map what those changes look like? But overall, globally, we are seeing definitely variations in marine mammal movement over time. And some of those movements can be associated with changes in temperature.
Oh, that's really cool how we can learn so much just by observing the movement of species too. So if we think about whales and seabirds, what are some of the behavioral changes that you've noticed?
So, in terms of behavior can be measured in a few different ways. If we're thinking about acoustics, it can be the type of sounds that the animals are creating. But if we're thinking about just kind of being next to or on the water, then of course, those are kind of visual behaviors, displays. I think a lot of people, when they think about behavior of a marine mammal, things like killer whales and humpback whales might come to mind, reaching out of the water, those types of behaviors. And so changes over time, again, you need those long-term studies. It really has to do with movement. It also may be about predating. So, eating is a behavior. And are they eating in different areas? The same as where they're having their young. So are they having their young in different areas, or are they staying longer in different areas where they perhaps weren't before? And is that something that we can associate with a behavioral change, or is this something that we've never known before? So marine mammals can be very elusive. They can be very hard to track. They can be, if they're not making sound and they're not at the surface of the water, it's like a theoretical question of how do you even know they're there? And so there's a lot of effort that has to go into monitoring these types of potential changes.
Thank you, Ashley. Now, I wanted to ask you something kind of on the side. Recently, I read an article about how whales' songs are actually songs.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to know if you could speak more about that because that's something that just really fascinated me. And I want to know your thoughts
This
on
is one
that.
of my favorite topics. So I'm riveting to have at a dinner party. But when it comes to whale song, so all marine mammals create sound, but not all marine mammals sing. And so when we're thinking about song, the easiest example to use is a humpback whale, but lots of different baleen whales and others create song. Song is actually a pattern over time. And what we're finding out, for example, is that there are definitely messages embedded in that song, and songs can rhyme. And so there's lots of, again, the humpback whale is that iconic singing species. And so we always used to think, for example, that they only sang on their breeding grounds, which is actually incorrect. They also sing on their feeding grounds. And we've also learned that they do have rhyming scheme, that they change their song every season, that sometimes it gets more complex with age. And so I have to give a shout out. It's actually to a Dal researcher a number of years ago. I was at the Marine Mammal Conference in Barcelona, Spain. And this particular, I think she was doing her master's, maybe her PhD. She gave a 5-minute presentation on song, humpback whale song, and how it rhymed. And she rhymed her entire presentation. So I thought that was pretty amazing. And a shout out to her, wherever she is.
That is so fascinating. Wow. Oh my gosh. Thank you for that, Ashley. Now, I want to throw it back to Laura because, as Ashley kind of alluded to it as well, when we're witnessing some of these behavioral changes in whale species and seabirds, it gets us to think, what are some of those larger ecosystem changes that might be happening in the ocean? And so, Laura, when you think about your research, can you speak to some of the changes that might be occurring in marine and aquatic ecosystems that you've been recognizing, and how might this influence the overall food web? And can you describe what some of those changes look like?
Wow, that's quite the question. In terms of zooplankton, I think a lot of this research concentration has been on the effects of climate change and the warming of oceans on planktonic food webs. One of the relatively interesting things that's happening in a lot of temperate and more northern areas is that species composition is changing towards more boreal species. So a lot of northern waters seem to be harboring species that used to be in much more southern latitudes. So there's a lot of change in species composition just because of these warming temperatures. Another interesting thing about zooplankton is that usually zooplankton's size correlates quite well with development temperature, or the temperature at what they're developing at. So a lot of smaller copepods are more common in warm waters versus these large energy-rich copepods in Arctic and northern cold waters. So you can imagine what the effects of warming temperature and warming water is on basically zooplankton size, and what the effects of the copepods and other zooplankton becoming smaller are on the food web.
Thank you for that, Laura. It's interesting to think of effects throughout the entire ecosystem from the lower level. I'm grateful to have you both on here, and thank you both for taking part in this effort to tell the story of the people and the place that is Gros Morne.
Thank you,
Thank
Jack.
you so much.
In the next episode, we're going to continue our discussion with Ashley and Laura, and we're going to explore how scientific work by experts like Ashley and Laura might contribute to sustainable economic development, and how further research can support conservation and stewardship efforts for these coastal communities. Be sure not to miss the next episode, and subscribe to the podcast now and follow along as we tell the story of Gros Morne, the people, place, and the ocean.